The creative action of making something can be euphoric. Maybe it's the thrill of pulling something off, or maybe it's the process of watching your ideas come to life. Different materials, elements, and techniques force you to think differently. And when you're willing to step outside of your comfort zone, the unknown has all sorts of surprises. Sometimes it's laughter, and other times it's defeat. But how else are you supposed to get to the other side if you're not willing to take chances? This project beat me to the bitter end because I was willing to take those chances. But maybe it's true. Greater risk equals greater reward.
Oh, they're beautiful!
To start this project off, I'm using a perloid acrylic sheet. The reason I'm beginning with this is because I really don't know how I'm going to cut it and how it's going to turn out, and I want to have time to be able to reorder some if I do end up screwing it up. This acrylic will serve as an inlay or overlay on the nightstands. And since I'm not using a CNC in any part of this project, I need to lay everything out so I know where to cut. So following a circle that I made as a reference, I'm using a compass to lay out the lines exactly where they need to go. This is a cool trick that classical craftsmen used to do way back when. So I don't technically need to draw lines because I think I'm going to be using the track saw to cut this, but I might as well do it anyways so that I don't screw up the position of the track.
So luckily, since I did my measurements correctly, all of the lines converged in the center. If I did this wrong, then these would have all been offset and it would have been kind of a mess.
I do want to make sure that I don't cut into my reference square lines though, so I should erase those. I know right now the acrylic looks a little boring, but I assure you when we start taking off that paper backing, it's going to look really, really nice. But for now, this paper backing is coming in handy because I just want to temporarily fix it to the plywood. Since I want my track saw blade to be cutting on the dead center of each line, I'm using this guide to make sure that I put the track in the exact right spot so that that blade is in fact centered. And this process is seeming to work phenomenally well as long as I clean off the shavings afterwards so that my track doesn't slip on the next cut. I think it's a smart idea if I number these so that I don't lose track of which one goes where.
So I wasn't always going to use this pearl acrylic. Instead, I was actually going to use real mother of pearl veneers, which look really, really good when they're horizontal because the light hits them really nicely. But when you get them vertical and to the height that the nightstands are going to be, they turn into this nasty, milky, not pearl looking substance, and it just doesn't look good anymore. So traditionally, guitar makers would use something called celluloid, which looks a lot like this, and it's really pearlescent, but it yellows in age, and we do not want this to yellow. So I looked this up, which is acrylic, and it won't yellow, and it's just gonna give me exactly what I need and a more consistent look. Also, this is so weird, but if you've ever smelled like a really old ashtray and the cigarette butts have been sitting in there for months, that's exactly what this smells like. It is so weird.
The acrylic by itself would make for a pretty floppy drawer face, so I need to attach it to something stable that has some thickness and strength to it. And since the perloid has some translucence, I think it would be a smart idea to spray everything white. That way when everything's attached, it has the brightest and clearest color possible. This primer is catalyzed, that way I don't have any problems with the spray adhesive. This project was inspired by a photo that the client sent. They had taken a picture of a magazine and wanted me to recreate this design with a few changes.
So if I leave all of these in sequential order, then there will really be no natural break in the pattern of the resin itself. And I want it to look more like the picture or the model that I made, where one piece is lighter, the other one's darker, and things like that. But the only way I can do that is if I switch some of the pieces around. And I can only switch certain pieces around, otherwise they don't fit in the spots that they're supposed to go.
I just need to remember if I switched every other piece, then I need to switch every other number. And at this point, I could leave every piece square on the edges, but I want to put a tiny, tiny little bevel. That way there's some division between each piece. And by tiny, I more or less mean microscopic. I could barely even get a shot of this with my zoom lens. I'll have Bridget sand off the paper fluffs so that we can make sure each bevel is perfect, and I suspect this is going to take a while, so we might as well make an afternoon of it. Since the saw blade obviously had some kerf, there are two pieces at the end that need their tips sanded off so that they can be forced in and wedged tight like the rest. The center doesn't really matter anyways because it's not going to be glued down since it will be cut out later. We already learned that this film does not adhere well to spray adhesive, so we have to take it off if we're going to glue these to the drawer faces. So this is a great time to see if swapping them created that light variation that we were hoping for, and it worked perfectly, so we can scuff sand the back sides.
So we didn't realize that we were screwing everything up, and it just happened in the blink of an eye. I didn't realize that Bridget was taking off the front side paper rather than the back side. And instead of me checking, I just went and sanded them, and I ended up sanding 3 of these on the beautiful glossy face, basically destroying them. So now we have to figure out whether we can buff everything back to perfection or if we have to buy a whole new pearl sheet and start from the beginning.
Luckily or unluckily, with each new material comes new problems. And ironically enough, this project is for the same clients that I did the high gloss walnut table build for, and I spent days buffing their table. So the irony is, here I am buffing yet another project for them, but I guess that's what you get when your clients love high gloss furniture. And by now, I think you could consider me a pro at buffing.
Oh, well, the area is definitely a mess, but thankfully, every single piece is back to normal and we can continue the process.
So for this go around, Bridget is making sure she's peeling off the backside film of every piece, and I'm also making sure that it's indeed the backside that I'm sanding. What a concept. Just like I laid out the pattern on the acrylic before, I need to lay out some sort of reference so that I know where to glue everything on the drawer faces. So some square lines will do the trick for placement, and that center circle is just to show where I shouldn't put glue, because I will eventually want those pieces to be pulled up, and if I glue them down, I might never get them up. The first pieces to be glued on are the ones that will be standing vertical when the drawer faces are on. And before they're attached, it's a lot easier to buff the edges now. That way it's a lot harder for dirt to get stuck in the grooves over the years. It also adds a smooth edge for a nice tactile feel. Now, if I didn't have a lot of experience, I would probably just start spraying this whole thing and sticking them on willy-nilly. But I already performed an adhesion test where I sprayed the substrate, then sprayed the acrylic, but I also immediately stuck it on. And if I don't perform that exact same operation, then that test was basically for no reason. Oh, and by the way, here's the results of that test.
Oh my gosh, that won't come off at all. Oh.
So for the first few, I'm doing one at a time so I get a good groove down before I start doing multiples. And covering the areas that I don't want sprayed will just make sure I don't get overspray all over everything. For some weird reason, the tips are curving in, so I need to lock those in with a piece of plywood.
Man.
You can see by now that there's blue tape on the ones that we previously screwed up, and that's just to protect them since I went through all the work of buffing them.
Oh man, I cannot wait until I can just rip off all this paper. It is gonna be a good day. Also, if you notice that these end pieces are kind of inset, and that's because I had to sand them away, so they gently slid in further and further as I sanded them. And don't worry, I gave myself like 4 inches of extra room on either side because I knew I was gonna have to fiddle with it, and I did not want to run out of space. So now we can continue.
So besides me almost stabbing my hand, the basic premise here is that I'm using the router to cut a series of circles, and using the same drill bit to drill the hole and as the pin will make sure that it's a good tight fit.
So I'm gonna start my cut on the horizontal plane because this board is gonna get cut in half into 2 drawer faces. And I wanna start my cut on that line that's getting cut in case there's weird inconsistencies where I start and eventually stop.
Right now I'm cutting circular grooves about halfway into the acrylic. This will just mimic about the same amount of gap as the pieces have with their beveled edges. Then all the lines will have a consistent look throughout the piece, which will make it look a lot more planned and elegant rather than unplanned and pieced together. The only problem that this presents is when the router cuts the V groove, it creates a paper fluff, which then makes the router sit higher than it normally would be. So the fluff needs to be sanded off and the groove needs to be routed again, that way everything is consistent throughout the entire circle. Now the second circle can be routed, and you can see where the blue tape held the router higher, the groove is much thinner. And that's exactly why we need to do 2 passes so that we don't screw everything up. This last smaller circle needs to be cut all the way through, so I'm changing the depth of cut. This center circle will be where we previously marked out to not put any glue. So as long as everything works like it was planned to, everything should pop up.
Well, everything went great. There were no screw ups whatsoever, which I'm very happy. Now I can cut the brass to fit in that beautiful circle, and this is going to look so good.
This is 1/16 inch thick brass, and as long as I go really slow with the saw and use my dedicated blade that's kind of a crappy blade, then I should be able to cut through it just fine.
Brass is just one of those things that I learned to love and hate all at the same time. On one hand, it adds a beautiful aesthetic to the finished piece, but on another hand, it's kind of annoying to work with. It can be a little challenging to cut, so you need to use sharp bits. And this bit from Bits and Bits is exactly what I need because it cuts through this stuff like butter. And I'm really not kidding, it cuts in one pass, no problem. And even though brass is kind of a pain in the ass, it challenges me as a creator, and that is something special. And that goes for a lot of the materials we're going to be using in this project. And bummer, it's too loose, so I'm going to have to recut it and make sure that puppy is nice and tight. And I also need to make sure I don't reuse the previous hole, because that would be silly. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, different materials make you think differently, and whether or not you're a beginner or a master craftsman, I think a little bit of challenge once in a while helps us.
So that bit literally cut like butter. I could not be happier. And I'm about to take this film off, but if I use bare hands, I will make finger marks because of the brass patinas. So I need to make sure I put gloves on first.
So I'm actually scuffing the back and the front. The back is for adhesion and the front is for a brushed look. I'm using the straightest strokes I can on the front side, otherwise any rogue strokes will be highly visible. In a previous video, I was told by some viewers that I should try an adhesion promoter. So here I am trying that, and it leaves horrible bubbles no matter which way I apply it. So no way, Jose, I'm wiping that stuff right back off and spraying it with a high-grade urethane. Having to redo things like this takes a lot of patience and a lot more time out of my day. I actually get so preoccupied during projects that sometimes I forget to take a break and eat. I find myself making mistakes and getting irritable over the smallest of things. Not to mention, I have to find the time to grocery shop for our home and the shop separately, which seems impossible some weeks.
So all of this has led me down a path of junk food and stomach problems until I started using today's sponsor, Hungry Root. Hungry Root provides an honest solution to a problem we all have. Meal planning, grocery shopping, cooking, and cleanup all take a lot of time, so you might as well let Hungry Root do most of that work for you. They provide the smartest way to buy healthy groceries, fresh produce, supplements, and simple yet delicious recipes or pre-made meals. They build a personalized cart after getting to know your favorite foods, dietary restrictions, or personal health goals, and fill your grocery cart every week so that you don't have to, unless you choose to edit your cart. And my favorite part is that the recipes are all fresh, but the prep times are ridiculously short. We made this Thai coconut chicken in 6 minutes flat, and it was amazing, by the way. And this tikka masala with green beans took 7 minutes, and it barely made any dirty dishes, saving even more time during cleanup. I really think you should try Hungry Root because it will literally change the way you shop and eat. You can use our QR code or go to hungryroot.com and use our discount code Fortress40. Give it a shot because I really think you'll enjoy it, and thanks Hungry Root for sponsoring today's video. Alright, it's time to work with these honkin' boys. I ended up having to get 6/4 rift oak because they didn't have any 4/4, so we are gonna have to resaw these. And I need to resaw them now so that they have time to acclimate. Oh man, these puppies are heavy.
You know what's funny? I work out every single morning before work, and this oak still whoops my butt. It really is just some heavy, heavy stuff. But this rift cut is so much more worth it. I think it's way more beautiful than the standard flat sawn cut, at least in this composition that it's going to be in, because it's going to be black. And trust me, I know it seems like a sin to cover up the beautiful grain with black, but I'm utilizing the grain structure in order to make the black finish look textured. And this is a common type of finishing that has been around for a long time.
Resawing is a finicky thing, and if you've ever tried it before, you've probably gotten some pretty bad blade drift. And there are ways to make sure that you basically get perfect results every single time. So I made a tips and tricks video more about this over on my Patreon. It goes into finer detail on how to get perfect results. In fact, I've posted many different tips and tricks videos for this project alone.
Nice. That worked really, really well. Instead of milling these to final size today, I need to let them acclimate for a little while because they're probably going to start bowing and doing some weird cupping, and I want to make sure I can get that out later, so I'll mill next week.
Letting the air access every side of these boards will help the acclimation process and just speed it up. Especially since I don't have weeks to let these sit, I really only have about a weekend. But the nightstand drawers need to have a nightstand to sit in. So I might as well work on making some robust boxes that we will eventually attach tile to, which is going to be a rather fun process. This, on the other hand, is a rather straightforward process. I'm just using 1/2-inch oak plywood, that way all of the oak elements remain consistent. I should have made this jig years ago. It squares my crosscut sled perfectly every single time. And that extra knob that I added makes sure that the fence never gets knocked out of alignment. So this solves a problem that I had for a long time. I was never able to trust whether my cuts were perfectly square or not without checking them. And now I literally don't have to check them. Which, if you know what I mean, feels like a literal miracle. As you might know, square cuts are very important, and when they're perfectly square, it makes your life a lot easier. So hear me out. This might seem a little risque in the world of woodworking, but instead of using some beautiful form of joinery, yep, I'm using screws. Because they're fulfilling several different tasks all in one. They're pulling the joint really tight, squeezing out the excess glue. They'll hold that joint forever tightly together, and most importantly, they're getting covered up. I know that there are people that think screws are the antichrist of woodworking, but if you're not willing to use them when they seem very practical to use anyways, then I feel like you're just limiting yourself. The nightstands have a very short toe kick that give the impression that the furniture is floating. So I'm gonna make these out of that very robust 6/4 oak so that they're extremely strong considering everything is going to be very heavy. And I don't know what the deal is, but I'm getting covered in sawdust right now. Aha, that's your problem. Maybe it's because you haven't emptied your dust collector since Cody left 6 months ago. Now I should actually have dust collection, which would be really, really nice. Everything as it presents itself is mitered together. So I'm gonna be using screws from the outside. I'm just kidding, I'm gonna be using dominoes. This is where a floating tenon is extremely practical, and the miter alone would probably hold together for a while, but not for 100 years. And here at Fortress, we build furniture to last generations. So sure, a miter might last a strength test because it's about a week old, but give that miter maybe 5 to 15 years for wood movement to set in, and it will likely not be together anymore. That's why joinery was invented in the first place. So these corner blocks, which are similar to an end grain miter joint, are not only glued on, but they're pinned on. That way, if the glue fails in the future, the pins will still hold them in place. The point of having such robust corners is so that I can add leveling feet. And these holes are strategically placed so that I don't drill through the dominoes and essentially take away the joinery. The leveling feet themselves have too long of posts, so I have to cut them down. And the lock nuts make sure that I can re-establish those threads when I pull them off. I also didn't realize how beautiful this process could be. Now they don't protrude on the other side, and we can attach everything without any posts interfering with the process. This is why I love crafting, because there are a lot of different choices that I could have made. I could have drilled holes into the bottom of the cabinet so that the longer posts could have gone through, or I could have left the feet long and let them stick out.
So the reason why there's only a 1/2 inch back set on the front, but an 1.5 inch back set on the sides is because after the drawer faces go on, they'll add that extra inch and make up the difference.
Even on fine furniture, I like to use drawer slides, even though it kind of feels a little kitcheny. They provide a much smoother motion and don't really need much upkeep.
Man, that is gonna be a heavy box after there's tile on the outsides. But first, I need to work on the drawer boxes using that lumber that we resawed last week.
Now the stuff is ready because it is nice and bowed, but not really as much as flat sawn oak would have. This rift sawn stuff is incredibly stable, actually surprisingly stable. So much so that these are really easy to flatten, and there was no checking on any of my rough boards when I first started. So a lot of the problems that we have with boards warping and such is probably due to the changing grain within them. I also got a few guitar quality figured boards. Too bad I'm painting them black. I know, it's a shame, but sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. And I feel like that's just how luck plays out. If I was looking for figured boards, of course I wouldn't be able to find any. But since I'm spraying this black, of course the most beautiful boards pop up to remind me that sometimes I have to betray my inner woodworker to make the client happy. But hey, it's worth it because these clients have some of the most fanciest taste that I've seen, and I like it. So I'm placing my bets. My normal drawer boxes in my day-to-day builds only have 1/4 inch grooves for 1/4 inch bottoms, but in this case, since I have that 1/2 inch oak plywood, I'm using that instead, so the groove has to be wider. In a Patreon video, I talk about how fitting box joints can be a lot more tedious than people think, and I'm just so glad that I took the time to make sure these were gonna fit perfectly, because they slide together exactly like they should, and all it takes is a few pins to hold them together. If you've ever put perfect box joints together, then you know what I mean. It's just so satisfying. In one of my previous videos, I talk about how taking the extra time to cut better joinery leads to a more satisfying approach. And when you're more satisfied, you have more potential to continue to succeed. And that's exactly what these box joints did for me. Sure, they may be getting covered up with black, but it wasn't about the joint. It was about being patient with myself and enjoying the process.
So after thinking about it, I think I want to add a profile to the top of these drawer boxes, mainly because everything else is going to have to be so square because the tile's going to be square, the drawer faces are going to be square. I want to add some sort of profile. So I think I'm going to do a beveled edge on both sides.
Since this is really the only portion of the build where I'm working with wood, I want to make this part interesting. Especially since everything else is going to have so much artistic flair and uniqueness. I just think a simple profile at the top can go a long way and add to the overall caliber of this piece.
So I think that was definitely the right choice. I like them a lot more because that double bevel just adds some profile, adds some interest. And it also added a little bit of a curve on the inside corners since the router bit obviously can't make a right angle. And I think I really like that curve, so I'm gonna leave it and we can continue. I'm actually pretty excited because now we can finish the drawer faces and these things are going to be chef's kiss.
So a chef's kiss is a term usually used for food, and I guess we could eat this, but it might be the last time we eat a project, especially since this brass would eat my table saw blade if I didn't remember to turn it into bypass mode, because we are about to cut these drawer faces in half finally. And I knew this was going to be a satisfying process, but I didn't know it was going to be this satisfying. Before I turn the saw on normally again, I want to make sure I get all the brass shavings out, that way they don't accidentally trigger the machine.
Well, that was nerve-wracking. I don't know why, even though the saw stop was in bypass mode, it literally felt like it was just gonna explode on me at any moment. And I already cut my finger on this intensely sharp brass, so I better round that over a little bit so I don't cut my finger off.
With the centerline cuts established, I can cut the remaining sides, making sure that I undersize everything a little bit because there will be wood edging. In the original picture that the client sent, it looked like there was actually brass edging around all the drawer faces, but we decided that the budget was not high enough for that, so instead I'm doing a black oak edging. And that is a-okay with me because it would be a pain to have to put brass around every edge of these. Because not only would it add cost of the brass itself, but it would add a tremendous amount of time to have to cut the brass and attach it and flush trim it and all those things. We will be making custom brass handles in this video though, which is going to be pretty freaking awesome. So stick around because it's going to get interesting. I'm making sure that the oak is flush with the acrylic rather than the paper, which is raised. This fine detail is more important than you'd think because if I flushed it with the paper, then after we pull all the paper off later, the oak would be proud and it would just get caught with things and dirty and fingernails would get caught on it. The whole world would explode. So you get it now. I have a perfectionism that is beyond comprehension. I need to clean any squeeze out the same day, that way it actually comes off before the glue cures for too long. So within a few hours of the strips being glued on, we're now taking off that tape and paper so that I can clean up all of the edges. If I left this overnight, then this paper would probably be glued on forever. My OCD noticed that there was this little micro piece that was missing from one of the acrylic. So the smart part of me thinks that we should just fill it with some CA glue and the activator will turn it white, right? Which is perfect because we want it to be white, but the dumb part of me forgot to think that CA glue wicks. Yep, and it wicked all over my pre-finished brass, which is going to be really hard to fix. So I tried, and I tried, and I tried again. But it's never gonna look the way it did before without just completely respraying it. So can you guess what I did? Overall, I spent an hour and a half trying to fix the brass the hard way rather than just the 5 minutes that it took to respray it.
So I just realized my next step was going to be cutting these strips thinner because I oversized them in order to make gluing them on easier. But the tile isn't on the nightstand yet, so I don't know the actual width and height of it. So I should just wait on these and start with the tile.
This tile will serve as an elegant outer shell as well as a very durable surface. One way to make it seamless is by adding miters at the top corners.
Bummer. I was setting up this tile saw and I realized that it doesn't have enough throat depth here for me to cut those big tile in half. And then on top of it, with the way it tilts, I would have had to cut my miters upside down and it would have just been a mess. So instead I got this big beast of a saw.
If you've never cut tile before, it's actually kind of a lot of fun because you get to use a wet saw. And I've cut a lot of tile doing remodeling over the years, but I've never used a large rail saw like this, so I'm sure there's going to be some surprises. I'm about to try something that's a little unorthodox for tile work. I just want to try if I can use a special tape and make the markings on that so that my cuts are much cleaner, kind of like you do with blue tape and using a table saw. My hope is that the tape will keep the miter nice and sharp, but unfortunately, it just doesn't work at all. I guess I'm just gonna have to go really, really slow so that I get the sharpest cut that I possibly can. And that's fine. It's nice to work with a new material even if I have to be extremely patient with it. And that's even with a time limit on this saw because I only have it for 4 hours. I do not want to have to pay for multiple days of renting this big ol' thing. And luckily I don't really have any problems along the way, which is good because it's time to move on. And I wouldn't be a professional if I didn't do a good adhesion test.
Oh my gosh, that stuff is incredibly strong. Wow, it broke the freaking tile.
So the 5-minute epoxy I'm going to use is clearly strong enough, basically stronger than the tile itself. And here's another unorthodox thing that you probably don't see in the tile world all that often. And it kind of looks genius, but really all that's happening is this tile's being heated up and there's no cutting happening. So I'm going to have to try something else, and I think this little diamond wheel will do just the trick. It's cutting just enough where I'm making progress, but it's also not too aggressive where I'm causing chipping on the miters. And this is where new materials really help me think outside the box, figuratively and literally. When it comes to tile work, you typically always use some form of thin set. And here I am being a good boy, listening to the guy at the tile shop using a modified thin set that's made for plywood. But I didn't do an adhesion test, so I sure hope nothing happens. And at this point, I'm pretty confident that everything will work out. I have accounted for the thickness of the thin set to make sure the miters will still go together, and I have a plan for a way to make my miters as tight as I can using a little bit of woodwork trickery. That trick is, of course, the packing tape trick, which honestly is one of the best tricks ever known to man for miters. The only scary part is I'm folding rather long tile miters. These aren't easy peasy wood joints. The terrifying part is you can hear the creaking and cracking as I fold it down, and the look on my face says it all. My confidence is starting to mature a little bit. It was strong before, but now that I've seen proof that it works, I think the rest is going to go just fine. We have a good system down, and the creaking is just part of the madness. The most important part from here is that everything is parallel, the same distance apart, and square. Because if one of these is even off, then most likely all of them are off. And that would make it extremely hard to fit the drawer faces later on. But that confidence that I was speaking about earlier was wrong.
So it's been the weekend and I came back to a not so good surprise. I don't know what happened, but there was like catastrophic failure. All of a sudden the miters opened up and like delaminated from each other. The thin set like separated. There's like no adhesion anywhere, which means I'm gonna have to pull this entire thing apart, and there's two of them, as you can see.
We basically pondered this idea for the rest of the day. How could this have happened? I mean, literally no adhesion. I even tested the miters, as you remember, and they were extremely strong. So literally what happened? Well, I think my worst enemy came to bite me in the butt again, and that is wood movement. I firmly believe that the moisture in the thin set caused the MDF in the plywood to expand in all directions. And this happened before the epoxy and the thin set had time to fully cure. Which, in the end, is pretty heartbreaking, honestly. The thought of having to scrape everything back to bare bones is just killing us. Especially when we do test after test to make sure everything is perfect, yet it still stabs us in the back. And this painful moment lasted until suddenly...
I'm just exhausted.
Honestly, I think Bridget handled it a lot better than I did. I mean, I had my panties in a bunch for more than half the day until I realized how lucky we were that everything was coming apart so easily. And on this go around, I'm making sure this thing never comes apart ever again. So I'm making sure to clean the surface and to dry it to make sure there's no moisture left. And I'm using a 3X construction adhesive that I was originally going to use anyways, which is such a knee slapper to think about. And that's because it has one magical property. It doesn't have any moisture in it.
My hands are just so freaking tired already. It's just, they're like, please, dude, give us a break. And I'm, of course, like, absolutely not.
Yeah, my hands are quite literally begging for mercy by now because it is the same day as the scraping. But we want to get these finished to make up for lost time, and by we, I mean I. While the tile adhesives are all curing, it's time to cut some more brass. This specifically is 1/4 inch 260H02 brass. I know, crazy, huh? You probably have no clue what I'm talking about, and neither do I. All I know is it's the same brass as the 16th version that I was using earlier, and this piece cost $230 by itself. So I think it goes without saying I should probably take my time and cut very slowly. Which slow it will be because these shavings keep getting caught and stopping my router. These brass handles are an integral part of what brings this whole look to life. If you ask me, the overall composition wouldn't even be complete without this last circle that the handles represent. And thankfully, cutting the outer perimeter was pretty easy peasy. So as long as I don't break any bits, the inside cut should go just fine too, right?
Wow, I am shocked that I didn't break a bit while cutting both of those. Except for this bit. I guess I definitely broke a bit while cutting those.
And here's another surprise. I'm forgetting that I need to make a whole nother handle because there's a whole nother nightstand. Can you maybe guess where I put that video? Well, you guessed correctly. It's over on my Patreon, and we have some pretty awesome news to share. Bridget has helped me realize that I use a lot of materials as a woodworking business, but I have really no way to replenish them. In other words, this beautiful earth gives us tree after tree, and we keep taking and taking. But the real question is, what if we could start giving back? So this inspired us to create a new Patreon tier called the Formal Garden. And the amazing purpose of this tier is so that we can plant trees every single month based on the number of members that are in that tier. And on top of it, Fortress will match that number so that we can double the overall number of trees planted per month. New members will get all of the exclusive videos and content that we post, an honorary welcome package, and the opportunity to pick where the trees will be planted, since we picked an organization that provides that. So if you want to join and be a part of the change, go to patreon.com/FortressFineWoodworks, and a special thanks to the tree lovers that have already joined. These posts are the standoffs that'll hold the handles away from the drawer faces, but I'm not quite happy with how the machining turned out. So I'm going back to plan A, which is what I modeled in the beginning, and using round posts. And these will solve a few different issues. First of all, they have a bigger hole so the screw will go through it much easier than that tiny hole that I drilled through the square posts. And second of all, I didn't really have a way to keep the square posts from spinning if the screws ever came loose. And if these round posts ever spin, no one will ever notice because they're, well, round. The last bit of machining that I need to do is make sure that I tap these holes nice and straight. And as long as I keep the tap square with this little block, then I know the screw will go in straight as well. Everything needs to be degreased really well since I used oil for all sorts of different operations. Otherwise, while I'm sanding, it will grind that oil into the metal and I'll probably get bad adhesion with my finish. And that will wrap it up for these handles, so it's time to work on the tile. Again. And luckily everything stayed perfectly tight, probably because there was no moisture introduced. And the only nerve-wracking part is getting the residual epoxy off of the surface. For now, I'm going to smooth these miters over with a sanding block, but we'll touch them up later on. Funny enough, I actually tested wood glue on the edge of the tile and it works amazing, which comes in handy because I need to glue wooden strips on the front side just to edge band everything and make it look a lot prettier. And by now I'm really starting to imagine the different possibilities that our creativity can allow. Mixing different materials, components, and substrates can be a lot more challenging, but it sure is a lot more fun. And sure, this project definitely brought out the imposter syndrome in me. It tested me to my limits, and trust me, we're not done yet. There's still plenty of steps to screw up, which is exciting. And though it seems a little unusual, that's actually my message to you. I think we all deal with a little imposter syndrome from time to time, especially if we're trying new things that we're bad at. For me, I learned that I should basically test everything. Adhesion is basically the bane of my existence, and if a product says that it's good at something, don't trust it. I should test it first. But this process of learning is especially something that I enjoy because you get to follow along. And you and I together is a lot better than me alone. Before I go finishing everything, I want to test if those custom handles even fit. Because if they don't fit, I think I quit. But I can't believe it. The finishing stages are finally here, and all of this work has come down to this very moment. At this point, the amount of tasks that we can screw up is starting to diminish. And this oddly gives me a sense of relief while also raising the stakes and giving me more anxiety. Explain that, psychology majors. I'm spraying these brass handles with several light coats. Any runs and drips would basically ruin them as of right now, and I really don't want to have that happen. Remember those miters that needed some touch up? Well, I'm using a catalyzed finish that I tinted myself so that it matches. And I'm erring on the side of too dark rather than too light because I tested it and too light of a miter looks a little bit bright and weird, but a little bit too dark blends right in. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the clients for giving me the opportunity to show my skills. It's not often that I get to unleash my creative monster, but when I do, it sure feels good. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to watch this video all the way through, and I really hope you learned something.
Oh, they're beautiful!
Amazing.
Oh my gosh, they look gorgeous.
So cool.
So cool.
Hey, if you truly enjoyed this content, click subscribe on the left, and here's another awesome video to watch.